The story begins in 1945, right after World War II had just ended. On a remote island in England, a grand mansion suddenly became a mystery to everyone. In a single night, all the servants of the house vanished without leaving a trace. Strange, eerie sounds started echoing through the mansion, and the lady of the house, Grace, was on the verge of losing her sanity. She was raising her two children, Anne and Nicholas, all by herself, desperately waiting for her husband, who still hadn't returned from the war. Since the old servants had suddenly fled, Grace placed an ad in the newspaper to hire new ones. And as fate would have it, just a few days later, three people appeared at her doorstep: an elderly woman named Mrs. Mills, a young girl named Lydia, and an old man named Mr. Tuttle, who was supposed to take care of the garden. While showing them around the house, Grace explained the rules. But the strangest rule of all was that sunlight must never enter the children's rooms. Every window had to stay covered with heavy curtains, and every door had to remain closed at all times. The reason? Both children were allergic to sunlight. If sunlight touched their skin, horrible blisters would appear, and it could even cost them their lives. At first, everything seemed normal, but soon Grace grew suspicious. The truth was, her newspaper ad had never even been published. So where exactly had these three people come from? When she asked, they replied that they were just wandering around looking for work and thought they'd try their luck. Oh, and years ago, they had actually worked in this very mansion. Hearing this, Grace felt a little relieved. A little while later, the children were studying in their rooms, and the new servants were busy with their chores. Then all of a sudden, the sound of a child crying echoed through the house. Alarmed, Grace rushed into her son Nicholas's room, but he was calmly reading a book. Now Grace was confused. Whose crying had she heard? She immediately went to her daughter Anne's room, but everything was normal there too. That's when Anne mentioned a name: Victor. She said Victor had just been there, and now he must be playing with his family in the drawing room. Grace got furious. "Stop talking nonsense. Don't scare your brother with such spooky stories." But Anne kept insisting. Angry and frustrated, Grace scolded the servants for not closing the door properly, but the servants swore and said, "We didn't go there at all." As night fell, things got even worse. Anne started scaring her brother again, saying that Victor was being mischievous and wanted to pull the curtains off the window. Nicholas broke out in a sweat from fear. Seeing his condition, Grace rushed over, stood Anne up in anger, and punished her by making her read the Bible out loud. Grace herself sat downstairs, busy with her sewing. But just then, a loud thud came from upstairs. Grace thought maybe the servants were cleaning, but when she peeked out the window, all the servants were sitting outside. So the big question was, then who was making noise upstairs? Gathering courage, Grace climbed the stairs and asked her daughter, "Tell me, what's going on?" Anne replied, "Mom, they're in the storeroom." Grace opened the door, but there was no one there. However, whispers could definitely be heard. Now even Grace started to believe that maybe someone else really was present in the house. Anne sketched the shadows and faces she had been seeing on a piece of paper. Later, Grace saw the portraits of the old owners of the house and compared them to Anne's drawings. That's when Grace stumbled upon something very strange: an old photo album left behind by the mansion's previous owners. But what was shocking was that every person in the photos had their eyes tightly shut, as if hiding some secret. Grace couldn't understand what any of it meant. When she showed the album to Mr. Mills, he quietly said, "Madam, these people aren't asleep. They're all dead." Back in the old days, people believed that if a photo was taken after death, the soul would live forever. The album didn't just contain pictures of adults, but even of small children. Grace's heart sank, and she immediately told Mills to throw that cursed album out of the house. Meanwhile, Grace realized she might have misunderstood her daughter. Nicholas innocently asked, "Mom, when will Dad come back?" Grace lovingly explained, "Son, as soon as the war's over, Dad will return home." But the moment she left Nicholas, she clutched her husband's clothes and wept alone. Because the war had already ended months ago, and there was still no sign of her husband, suddenly the sound of a piano playing came from downstairs. Out of fear, Grace picked up a gun and went down to open the door. But as soon as she stepped into the room, the music from the piano vanished. There was no one inside. She quickly shut the piano, locked it, and started checking all the doors and windows of the house. But then she felt like the doors were closing on their own. Grace called Mills to unlock the door with the key, but when she peeked inside, she saw the piano open again. Now she was certain that humans weren't the only ones living in this mansion. There was a presence of some unknown force here, perhaps the souls of the old owners who still hadn't found peace. Filled with fear and anger, Grace immediately rushed out. Mills and Tuttle tried to stop her, but she said she had to go see the priest pray for the house. Before leaving, she ordered Tuttle to find the graves of the mansion's old owners and check if any of them were named Victor. Saying this, she disappeared into the thick fog. Mills and Tuttle exchanged looks as if they knew something they would never tell Grace. Meanwhile, as Grace wandered through the fog and lost her way, a shadow appeared ahead of her. When she looked closely, she was shocked. It was her husband. Finally, her husband had returned from the war. Grace happily brought him home to meet the children, and after a long time, the whole family was reunited. But her husband Charles was not well. The fear of war was still clearly written on his face. He quietly lay in bed, refusing to eat, but his presence gave Grace some comfort. She decided that from now on, no one in the house was allowed to talk about ghosts or spirits. A few days later, Anne's baptism was to take place. Grace dressed her in a white gown and placed a veil on her head. The daughter looked at herself in the mirror and was overjoyed. She looked just like a little bride. But as soon as Grace left, while playing around, she sat down on the floor and dirtied her gown. When Grace came back and saw her, she was furious. Grace was about to scold her daughter in anger when suddenly her steps froze. She noticed that Anne's hand looked a little strange. Grace slowly moved closer to her and was shocked. The face peeking from behind the veil wasn't that of an innocent little girl, but of an old woman. Grace screamed, and as soon as she lifted the veil, that wrinkled face disappeared in the blink of an eye. Grace was terrified, but slowly tried to compose herself. On the other hand, Anne was so scared that she couldn't understand why she kept seeing such horrifying visions again and again. Grace tried to talk to her husband, Charles, but suddenly he said, "I have to go back to the front." Grace was stunned because the war had ended long ago, but Charles insisted that the war wasn't over. They had a heated argument, and the next morning when Grace woke up, Charles had actually disappeared. Meanwhile, the children's condition was also worsening. As soon as Anne woke up, she screamed loudly. Grace rushed into the room and saw that all the curtains had vanished from the windows. The children could be burned by the sunlight, so she quickly covered them with clothes. Then she searched the whole house but couldn't find a single curtain. Finally, she hid the children in a small dark room, and even propped up a blackboard against the window to block out the light. Furious, she questioned Lydia about what was going on. But Mills replied in a cold voice, "It's just a trivial matter, madam." Hearing this made Grace's blood boil. In anger, she grabbed a gun and pointed it at them. She suspected that they were the ones playing tricks, trying to scare her and take over the mansion. She immediately threw all three of them out of the house. But the real horror had only just begun. Grace searched every corner of the house, but there was no trace of the curtains. By nightfall, Anne couldn't take it anymore. She and her brother slipped out through the window to look for their father. But as soon as they took a few steps outside, an old grave appeared in front of them. Out of curiosity, Annie walked over and read the name written on it, and her face turned pale. Meanwhile, Grace was searching the servants' quarters. There she found an old envelope. The photos inside made her shiver to the core. They were death photos of all three servants. The truth was out. These three people had died 50 years ago. The very spirits she had been afraid of were right there around her. Terrified, Grace grabbed a gun and rushed inside the house looking for the children. Somehow, she managed to bring them back into the room and locked the door. But then, the three servants quietly returned and in a mysterious tone said, "Madam, we are not here to harm you." The two children, scared to death, hid inside the closet. Just then, strange sounds started coming from outside. With trembling hands, Grace prayed and slowly opened the door. What she saw left her in total shock. Several people were sitting around a table, and among them was the same old woman Grace had seen before. That's when the entire truth was revealed. The ones who were really dead were none other than Grace and her own children. The reality was that after hearing the news of Charles's death during the war, Grace had a mental breakdown. In her grief and despair, she smothered her children with a pillow and then shot herself. But the biggest twist was that none of them had any idea they were dead. That's why they had been living in the mansion as if everything was normal. This was where the real suspense came out. The Mills were not ordinary people at all, but mediums, those who deliver messages from the living. The shadows, voices, and strangers Grace and her children always saw were, in fact, the real living people who had moved in as the new owners of the mansion. Even the old maid and gardener were long dead, but they wanted Grace to slowly realize the truth, which is why they kept giving her signs. But Grace never paid attention. Eventually, when the new owners realized the mansion was haunted, they got scared and ran away. And so Grace and her two children became eternal residents of the mansion. They were no longer bothered by the sunlight. No one pulled down the curtains anymore. For the first time, they were free to live openly in the mansion. And friends, this was the very reason why curtains would suddenly disappear, why the piano would start playing on its own, and why the servants vanished in just one night. In reality, the ghostly game was reversed. Humans were scared of ghosts, and ghosts and humans lived under the same roof, but belonged to different worlds. Whenever their worlds collided, an atmosphere of fear was created. So friends, this was one such story that proves sometimes the real secret of fear is hidden right before our eyes. And that is the greatest strength of this film. With this, the story ends here. Let me know your thoughts. Also, subscribe to this channel for more stories like this.